I've got 3 tours in Ellens for 7.5 years.
So I'll go ahead and turn off the light.
But today is the 110th anniversary of the 1909 explosion. They killed 10 miners. So I'm briefly going to acknowledge that event, and then I'll go to the one that I know more about. I'm a one-trick pony, okay? I'm not an expert in Upper County history overall. I know a lot about a small part of it. So anyway, this is taken from the mine explosion of 1910. And as you can see, it was kind of a big thing. And, you know, that was a building that you can still see the steel girders, but they didn't last either. And this is taken towards the end. The pile of wood is wood they managed to salvage, but you can see the smoke is still coming from the ground. Now, the interesting thing about this explosion is it occurred on a Sunday morning. Normally, they had 400 to 500 men working in that shaft. On Sunday, 10 were killed and you know, a handful of others injured. It was Sunday morning. In one case, a mother and her children were walking home from church, and her husband was in there. So it had a profound effect. The pictures are a little bit fuzzy because they come from a newspaper. This guy is named Polarich, and I'm sorry I didn't write down the first name. This guy's name is Jones. This guy's name is Isaacson. This guy's name is Arndale, William T. Arndale. And his is the family that I've made contact with, but haven't been able to follow through with an interview, or I'd be giving you a lot more program tonight. This guy's name was, excuse me, I have to look here because I'm a little off. Paul's Lyric was his name. And again, the newspaper was laminated, it has wrinkles in it. This guy's name is Hardy. This guy's name is Berger. No, this is Berger, the other guy was named Isaacson, and this one is Brunel. And, okay, now I'm to a different event. I think it's important to remember that those guys were killed, but there were over 250 miners killed in the mines up here. And the 1909 explosion was the second biggest, it had 10. The 1892 explosion had 42 men killed. That's probably just about double the number of people in this room. And 29 of them were husbands. 3 others were the primary breadwinners for like an invalid mother and sister. So it was catastrophic. How did I come to this story? This is where I'm going to give you my little biography. I started at Central in 1970, and in 1969 I had won the draft lottery. So I was majoring in draft evasion, and I took history classes, and that lasted till 1972. It all unraveled, and I got drafted, and so I spent 3 years in the Army. After that, I came back to Central, where I was photo editor of the university newspaper and completed degrees in journalism and in history, and then I continued on in graduate school in history because I wanted to stay and be editor of the university newspaper and continue that. So I did 2 more years, but I was never interested particularly in doing the project I needed to do to get my master's degree. I was just taking the classes to get the GI Bill. And I got a job as editor of the Grandview Herald for 9 years, and I wrote 4 books about the history of Prosser during that time. And one of the books that when I was working on my first one, I had a friend, Ruth, a dear friend, who was 30 years older than me. And I remember distinctly turning to Ruth and saying, Ruth, I really need to write the book about the explosion. And 7 years later, I had married, I had a stepdaughter, I had to get a real job. So I came back to Central and got my teaching certificate. And the first summer, I took 18 hours, to any of you that know college credits, that's a lot. So I said, my wife's name was Pat, I'd say, Pat, I've got to go to the library and do homework. And what did I do? I went to the library, got into the microfilm room, and started reading about the mine explosion. I had to know. So I did a story on it, just for myself. And I didn't get a teaching job the first year. So John Ludcup from the Daily Record gave me a half-time job. And in the process, he came to me in January of 1987. He said, Paul, I'd like to do a bunch of local history stories that have not been written before. And I go, duh, because I knew the mine explosion story could be published. And I did a lot of stories, and I'm not sure he was quite prepared for what he got, but anti-Chinese riots in Ellensburg probably weren't on top of his list, but it was, there were a lot of interesting things. Anyway, that's how I got into it. And then about 5 years ago, on the internet, I just happened to come across Tom Custer's name, and that got me back into it. Now, this first picture is number 5 mine. That's 1889. And if you look at it, it's just a hole in the ground. And those men crawled in there and dug coal every day. And you can imagine how dangerous it was. This is Roslyn, 1889. 1886, they opened the first real mining. Look at it, it's a full-blown town. Mines are up here. They brought in, they had a labor situation. They brought in black strikebreakers. They armed them with double-barrel shotguns. And it was a real tense situation. They took them up into Ronald. They built fortifications around number 3 mine up there, right where the general store is now. And it was an armed camp, and they had Pinkertons, which were hired thugs. They weren't anything much more than that. There to protect them and keep the locals away. It was a pretty ugly situation for a time, but the first strikebreakers they brought in, black ones, were a pretty rough lot, so I read, and they kind of pushed them on and hired more compliant blacks, and blacks were a big part of the community up there. Again, what I like about this picture, for black miners, it was a chance to own a home. They couldn't do that when they were sharecropping in the South or a lot of the other places. But Roslyn offered them a chance. Now, they were paid 85 cents a ton for the coal they dug. White miners were paid $1.15. But they could own a home. And that was pretty darn important. This is another home. This one, I believe, is David W. Reese's home, but I'm not sure. But this is a family of coal miners. This is home. This woman is Maud Rees. This was taken in 1889 when she came to Roslyn. You will see her again in a couple of pictures, so kind of remember, she's kind of an inspiration for the whole book. This is Thomas Rees, her uncle. This picture was taken just before he came here, but this is something really important. You see these chains, watch chains. that is the badge that said, I made it. And I'll be able to show it. Here's the Reeves family in Wales before they sailed to join Thomas. He came first. Notice the 12-year-old son. He's already an experienced miner. They came on this ship, the Paris, City of Paris, I think is the name of the ship. They would come in steerage, which was the storage compartment below deck, and instead of stacking it with boxes, they stacked it with people. And you'd have just a curtain between you and whoever else was on there. When the Reeves family came, they brought the family Bible. And this Bible is still in Upper County. This is #1 mine. It's the only picture I've ever seen of it. It's located north of Roslyn, but Ducktown. Any of you know Ducktown? Yeah, it's just above there. And this is the mine where the explosion is going to take place. This is Frances Cusworth. She came over with 8 children. Her husband came a year earlier, then sent for him. She came over with 8 children, and they sailed to New York, and then they caught a train to New Mexico where they joined up, and then they moved to Roslyn. This is the ship they came on. It's called the Germanica. And again, they were living down here below the deck in storage compartments, basically. This is the Cusworth family. The oldest son, Ernest, is not wearing a watch. And he was the oldest of the kids that came across, but this is Joe Jr. He's wearing the watch, and he's a stud. He's the guy you'd want playing, on your defensive line. His father, same watch. This picture is taken 2 weeks before they died. This is a man named Wynyard Steele. He was a coal miner from Wales, went to England, and then eventually came across, and again, notice this. But this is interesting. He could neither read nor write, and they photographed him with a stack of books. This is Wynyard Steele again, his wife Agnes, and Agnes's sisters. There's 3 of them here, and their husbands. And this is her father, Thomas. And they all came together. Now, the only one missing here is her son, or her brother, Hale. My memory doesn't always work. His last name is Hale, Mitchell Hale. And Mitchell Hale had served in the army, the English army in Egypt for 4 years, and it was a combat situation where they were fighting Egyptians off and on all the time. A lot of, it was just an ugly tour. He joined them as soon as he got discharged. This is called the Streeter Boys. I think this one is Agnes Hale's brother-in-law. What's interesting about these guys, they neither drank nor smoked. And this is a gag picture. These guys were teetotalers. They were straight as an arrow. Okay, this is Wynyard Steele. This is his son Walter. You're going to meet him again. Agnes is his widow. And this is Wynyard Jr. Wynyard Jr., I'll tell you about him in just a minute. Okay, here again is the reunited Reeves family. Thomas and his son David, and Margaret, and then the sisters. This is the explosion. Okay, this is the watch that, I can't see it. Was used by Thomas Rees, father of the Rees family. He and our brother David were killed in the mine gas explosion of 5/10/92. What's interesting about this watch was, it was in his pocket when the mine blew at 1:40. That watch stopped at the moment of the explosion. And it has that time frozen forever, because it's broken.
Is this the watch that Mike Miller has? Huh?
Yes, and this is, as far as I'm concerned, there is no single artifact in Kittitas County that is anywhere as significant as this watch. Now, if you were to go to an antique shop and just buy a watch like that didn't work, you might spend $20 for a wall hanger. This caught the moment in the largest catastrophe ever in Kittitas County. That's huge. Now, I'm going to read something to you. I don't need any lights. This book is based on the reporting that was done by a man named, I think his name is Ryerson. We can't even say for sure it is. And Ryerson was probably in Upper County when the mine blew, either here in Cleome or up in Roslyn. And in the next 36 hours or so, he sent dispatch after dispatch to the Seattle Press Times. And his accounts are so over the top cool as far as the quality of his journalism. And I just want to read one little excerpt. And again, it's called The Gloom of Death, is the chapter. The scenes among the bereaved and grief-stricken families of the dead and missing are pitiful to the last degree. Among those who caught his attention Tuesday afternoon was Frances Cusworth. Her husband and son were still missing in the mine. When Mrs. Cusworth heard of the disaster, she ran like a madwoman from her home of poverty to the mine. The woman grew a year older in the brief time which it took her to reach the scene. Her face became drawn with the mental torture which she passed through. Her ravings at the mine were extremely pitiful. For probably half an hour, tears streamed from her eyes, and no one could comfort her. Suddenly, as if seized with an inspiration, she exclaimed, "My husband is not dead. My boy will come home with him to supper." She turned and retraced her steps to her home and set about making preparations for supper. She set the table with unusual neatness and made every arrangement for the meal in the tidy manner of a good housewife. Her children were called into the house and washed, and their pallid little faces made to look bright and cheerful. 6 o'clock came, but her loved ones did not come. 7 o'clock, and still husband and son failed to arrive. Her neighbors watched her with feelings of profound pity. Before 8 o'clock, the poor woman, still nourishing her delusion, went outside and spoke to a man who had just left the mine. "Is it true?" she asked in a whisper. "My God, Mrs. Cusworth, it is only too true," came the answer from the stout-hearted fellow, with tears in his eyes. Not a sound escaped the woman's lips. She returned to her home, and there she wept. Later in the evening, her grief became terrible. All night long, she walked about her little frame house, crying in a most heart-rending manner. Today she is weak from exhaustion. "That poor woman is almost crazy from grief," said a woman who had lost her husband. Her anguish has been more than she can bear. If she does not die, it will surprise those who have watched her. That's great writing. That's great reporting. Whether anytime somebody can put that kind of detail down and take you there, and he wrote that the day it happened.
Wow.
You know, that's written within 24 hours of the explosion. He's on the scene. There's nothing that I can do as a writer to compete with that. And that's one of the things I learned, and I learned it with Heilman too. Get out of the way of your sources. That's a real hard thing for writers. Writers think, well, I'm the one that can craft the words and da 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 da. You can't compete with what they say when they're witnesses. Let the witnesses tell your story. Your job is to put it there together and just make conjunctions where they're needed. Anyway, so much for that.
Where is this watch at now?
What?
Where's that watch at now?
It's still in possession of the family.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. This is David and Thomas Reeves. Remember they came across? This is them in the firehouse. These miners had cleanup. These guys are all holding sponges because they were black with soot, and they're stripped naked under there. And then this guy is Anthony Stoves, who later became the Undertaker in Roslyn. But Thomas and David Reese. The other thing about these guys, notice that he's wearing a tie. He's wearing a tie. They're wearing their Sunday best. They went home and got dressed up to come and scrub these dead bodies. And these are the caskets that these two go in. And the next one is their home. This is in the house. The caskets are here in the house. This is Margaret and the three young kids. And one casket holds her husband, one of her son. This is a funeral service that took place in Unity Hall, and as I remember, it's for the single men, but I can't be positive on that. But this is a wonderful picture that was shot. The local photographer's name is E.E. James, and he's the one that shot all these pictures. And what he reported is amazing. This is, you've probably seen this picture before. Everybody said, oh, there's old time Roslyn. Well, it's more than that. This is the band, or you'll see these guys in the next screen. Here's the Black Widows, or Black people, and this is a funeral procession that's coming from Unity Hall. Here are the Masons, full regalia. They got the band out there. The streets lined with people. It was a big deal. This is the one that kills me, and I'll explain why. This wagon is waiting. There are 3 caskets up here. How do I know that? Because I've seen the picture, and the picture's gone. They're up here, in this corner, right here, there were 3 caskets on 6 sawhorses. The naked wood floor, the bare walls, only this window showing in the background, and the 3 caskets. It's the most stunning photograph. I saw it in 1977, I haven't seen it since. It's one of those things that's been lost over time. It was just an amazing picture. This is a picture at the Oddfellows. These are all caskets of Oddfellows members, and so are these. These are father's sons. That's a, you know, I wish I could blow this part up to a point where you could see them, the widows. But here, this is a picture of 16 out of the 29 widows. 7 of them were black, and you don't see any black people in this picture. An 8th lived in England. So you're down to 21. So there are 5 widows missing. I wished I could identify them all. I can't. Because I can identify Lizzie. This is Lizzie Davies. And these 4. This is Frances Cusworth. This is Jane Foster. This is Angelina Bianco. and this is Agnes Steele, but I don't know who the others are. And I certainly would love to know, because the wives are a reflection of the husband. It doesn't mean you all look the same, but you know, it just kind of has a way of making an association with a name that you can't make otherwise. This is Agnes Steele. This picture was taken after the gravestones arrived. Now, I don't know when hers arrived, but it could possibly be 1895, 3 years later. No, it's not that late because we still got a toddler here. But I don't know this man, but this is Thomas Hale, and this is his son Mitchell, who was killed in the explosion. And this is Agnes's brother, Agnes's husband, and her husband Wynyard left these kids. This is Wynyard Jr. He died 2 weeks before the explosion here. In an explosion in Canada, they killed 32 miners. He was one of 32 killed, and his brother Walter went there to get him. Now Walter's got an interesting story, and I think I got a picture of him here. This is Walter and his wife. Walter was in the mine when on that day, and his job was to open and shut a big wooden door that kind of blocked off the slope, and it had something to do with airflow. You know, so when the mule with the hauling the cart of coal came up, he would open the door, let them through, and then close the door. Well, at the time of the explosion, he opened the door, let the carts through, closed the door, and hopped on. Because he'd seen a piece of pie in one of the lunch pails up above. And he went to steal the pie. And when he and the driver were right at the entrance of the mine, it blew. And because Walter went to steal the pie, Agnes Steele didn't lose her son in addition to her husband and brother. And Walter actually ended up being a custodian at Roslyn Elementary for a number of years. Here again, this is the Bianco family. You got Angelina, and you got Dominic, and you got Joe. And it doesn't show real clear, but these are Dominic's fingers, where he's holding the kid's neck. Joe is holding his arm. They were having, you know, it was a real struggle to get that kid to sit still for a second. So, anyway, Dominic was killed in the explosion. Joe married Angelina and raised the 3 kids. That's pretty special. And here's their wedding picture. That's on their honeymoon in Montana. And, you know, you know, in a sense, it's like marrying your sister, I think.
How long after the explosion was the wedding?
Within a year.
Huh.
And they lived together. Angelina died, I think, in 1927, and Joe in 1932 or 33. They're buried in Redmond Cemetery, and I learned today the Redmond Cemetery in Roslyn is the only Redmond cemetery in the United States. That lodge, there are no other Redmond lodge cemeteries. But they're buried together. Dominique is buried in Old City up on the hill. But she chose, well, Joe chose to be buried with her, I guess is the way to say it. This is their daughter, Carlita. She died probably within a year of this picture, just shortly after giving birth. And here's the Biancos, Joe and the 2 boys and Angelina, and that was taken a year or 2 before Angelina died. These 4 widows, again, the one I'm going to focus on is Jane. Jane Foster had a young son, and her husband obviously was killed. This is Jane in the 1930s. Now, what happened to Jane? She struggled to survive. She was related to Stoves, and so she kind of lived with them, kind of didn't, and struggled to survive in Roslyn, but eventually moved to Seattle, and she put an ad in the paper to get married, and a guy from Canada, British Columbia, took her up on it, and they got married. And he had a son, and then they had 2 sons together. The guy was very, very abusive, physically and mentally. And her son, who was an infant, he would have been, maybe 9 or 10 years old when they got married. He grew up. And one day, he took on that abusive father and just threw him out of the house and said, "You're not coming back." And the 2 kids that they had together stuck up with that. But the one older son that went with his father. And when the father died, Jane and the 3 kids got nothing. And the son who went with him got everything. But she ended up having a decent life, with family and that. This is a picture of Jane. This is, I think this is probably in late 1940s, possibly 1950s. It's a granddaughter. The second to last widow died in 1952, I think. Give me a year or 2 either way. Jane died in 1963. She was the last of the widows to pass from the mine explosion. So she had a long life. It wasn't always easy, but it worked out for her. And this is her husband's gravestone. That was put in A.J. Kretschmer? Is that the name? It's A.J. somebody from who was a teacher and a descendant, or a relative, came to Nick Henderson back in the early 1990s and said, "I'm the only one who knows where this grave is. Let's put a stone on it." So this stone was actually put on the grave of John Foster in the early 1990s, or it would have been forgotten forever. Old City. Yeah, and Nick did. It had a curb, but it didn't have a stone. Nick put the stone in, and then he put a cement top on all of it. Really nice job. This is Lizzie Davies. She had some mental issues after her husband died, but she remarried. She had a daughter that died a year before her husband. This is their gravestone. It's in Knights of Pythias. And in 1927, when she died, she had her ashes buried here. This is the gravestone. Here's a plaque denoting that she had been placed in there. So these women, they were attached to their first husbands, even if they remarried. In most cases, the first husband was the one. I love this. Sarah Brennan McDermott, and they're related to Overspees. And if anybody knows someone with the last name Overspees that can have some family history, please let me know. She wrote the most incredible document in Spauna Coal Dust. Not only she wrote about the railroad journey out, and again, Dad was gone. It was Mom that had to do it all, and how they brought the little Tweety bird with them. And when the landlord came a day or 2 after they arrived, he didn't know that Brendan was bringing his whole family, and that it was a big family, and he kicked them out. And so they're in the process of going out, and the bird dies, and the kids secretly buried the canary in the backyard for fear that the landlord hates canaries too. But when they had 9 children, the 3 oldest girls were sent to Catholic school in Seattle because they couldn't afford to keep them. And her daughter Jenny Brennan Oversby is the one that just wrote such an amazing piece. But when she died in 1944, they brought her husband to Cleon. This stone probably sat in Old City, and they brought him and his stone and buried him next to her. Her second husband is buried off here somewhere. She's buried with her first husband. Okay, this is Annie Wright, Annie Graham. This is the stone. This is where she stood and cried tears when they placed her husband in the ground. And this stone is just laying flat on the ground. Thankfully, it's preserved. This is Frances Cusworth, who buried her son and her husband. The railroad company, the coal company, in its wisdom, was able to settle with the widows. They got $1,000 for the husband, $500 if the oldest son was killed, and $100 each for any kids under 12. They were paid 3 years later than the explosion. So the Cusworth family, like a lot of them, was living hand to mouth. They fortunately had Fred, one of those two, I can't tell from the view here, but Fred was the oldest son surviving. Fred was alive because of a hangover. The night before, on May 9th, Fred went on a bender. And when his dad and his brother and his mom went to wake him, they couldn't get him up because he had a hangover. Dad and brother go in and get killed. Fred was supposed to be with them. Fred survived at 16 years old, and for the next 3 years, he was the support for his family. When Frances got her settlement, she got $2,000. She did something I think is really remarkable. Linda Salter and I did some research on the cost of things. The tombstone would have cost $200 to $300, and you can figure probably no more than $100 for the fence. The clothing, all of these people, all the kids, and also Patrick McCabe that Frances married, and Frances might even have been pregnant in this picture, all have new clothes on. She had taken that money and spent $250, $300 on clothes for all her kids who had not seen new clothes for 3 years. And she bought the gravestone after 3 years. She put up the fence. And she did one other thing, and I'll point that out. Again, this is Patrick McCabe, the man she married. This is a daughter, I'm not going to guess the name. This is John, and that's Frances, and she's behind the fence, so she's hiding a little bit. And this is the brand new stone. This stone's still there. Top's gone, but the stone's there. This is Fred, the son of Frances, who supported the family. This is the one with the hangover. And this is his bride. Her name is Maud Reeves. Now, when she was 14 and he was 16, they were standing in the rain at the mouth of that tunnel with all that smoke and soot coming out. And, you know, it's rainy and people smell like musty clothes and in the mud and all that. and they're watching in horror. She lost her uncle and her cousin. He lost his brother and his dad. They got married within a month of his mother getting married to Patrick McCabe. She got the settlement, she married Patrick McCabe within 30 days. Fred's married, and so's the older sister. I think her name was Sarah. This is, remember the baby in the Cusworth family picture? This is her child. And this is Francis Cusworth McCabe in 1916. This is 1920. This is a grandson. I think his name might be Booze. This is Patrick McCabe and Francis, and this is the toddler, the 1-year-old, John, when his dad was killed. John was they had just come back from World War I, so this is summer 1919, and John had been gassed with mustard gas, and he was not able to mine. He got a job working in a ferry or something in Seattle, and he married but never had kids. This is Maud again, and she's the girl that I pointed out at the beginning too. This is Maud. This is Fred, and Fred always stands like this. He's just straight arrow. I mean, he must have had a broomstick for smiling. And this is their the 3 youngest children, and it doesn't show well here, but the baby's got a pipe in his mouth, a tobacco pipe. But there's a daughter missing here, and that's Frances. And Frances is the one taking the picture. And Frances marries Richard Owens of Owens Meats, and she's quite a lady, and so was Maud. This is again Maud. This is 1905. This is Frances, and the 3 older kids who weren't in that other picture. This is Frances Cusworth. This is Jane Reeves. Jane Reeves was Maud's mother. Her brother-in-law and his son were the ones killed, the Reeves that were killed in the mine. This is Fred again taking care of his mom, probably 1920. This is a picture of Maud as an old lady. She had worked on Spawn of Coal Dust, which was published in 1955. She died in 1957. And this is right in that time period. Now this is a picture of Fred. He died in 1942 or 44, somewhere in there. Complications of black lung. But this stovepipe is also significant because Frances, she bought new clothes for all her kids. She bought a headstone for her son and her husband and put the fence around. And she bought a really elaborate wood stove with porcelain inlay for Fred as a thank you gift for taking care of the family for 3 years. And that's $1,000 out of the $2,000. You know, she had her act together. I just respect those people. And this is the picture I shot. I shot that in March of 3 years ago on my first visit here to do a story, or to do the book. And that was, it just was what it was. Anyway, that's it. So, I'm done.
You were talking about the newspaper reporter who said that timely dispatch.
Yeah.
Was the story picked up nationally? I mean.
Oh yeah, some of it was. Newspapering. I used to be a newspaper editor. They're a den of thieves. If somebody publishes something you like, you put it in. And but Ryerson's stuff was not carried that far. I don't know why. There were a lot of stories that were, But Ryerson is an anomaly. I don't think he was actually a reporter, yet he did some of the finest reporting I've ever seen. I think that Ryerson just happened to be somebody that was on the scene, and he just plunged in and started writing, and that telegraph operator was probably going nuts, because he was just writing, but he went out and he talked to the people, and he wrote about Mrs. Cusworth and a whole bunch of other people, and described their situation, and none of the others did. So,
So, and
and I wish I could show you his biography, but I can't. I don't even know his. I can give you a 90%. His last name was Ryerson. I can give you a 10% that he went to Los Angeles, opened a business, failed, got divorced, and the next thing I know, 20 years later, he had a mule stolen, and that's it. And I can't even say that was him. But maybe that makes him even more special, because what he wrote, and it's all in here, it's incredible. It's just incredible what that man did. I spent 16 years of my life in journalism. I never touched what he did. Never even came close. It was just, he was the right man at the right place at the right time. And he was published in a newspaper that's extremely obscure. As far as I know, I saw it on microfilm at Central. The only other place I know that newspaper even exists is the Seattle Public Library. That's it. But what he achieved is bigger than a human being.